Hey, this is Bennett Sullivan, and you're watching Bennett Sullivan Music, and I have a really special guest with me here today. This is Mr. Danny Barnes. Thanks so much for being here, Danny.
Thank you, man.
So I just want to learn how you started playing banjo. I don't really know your history. I've heard your music, and I really love your music and your sense of creativity and style, your singing, your groove, but I want to know where you came from.
Well, when I started, I lived in a family. My family of origin was real music fans. You know, like my mother and dad were kind of had a lot of adoration for Grand Ole Opry people and stuff like that, and Bob Wills and so forth. They grew up like my mother grew up in the Depression in Texas, and my dad grew up in Alabama during the Depression, and they just sort of had this affinity for country and western singers and bluegrass guys, country guys, and so forth. And when I was a kid, it was just one of my earliest memories is the stereo. They used to have those stereos that looked like a piece of furniture, about like these chairs, the era of these chairs, but it'd be like a piece of furniture kind of, you know, the stereo. And it was a focal point of your living room, you know, your stereo. And my dad, when I was a little kid, he would play records, and he wanted you kind of had to like look at the stereo like you were watching TV, like he'd play records and you had to sit and look at the speakers or look at it, you know, like he didn't really want you talking when he was playing records and stuff. So I learned sort of early on to pay attention to this stuff, you know. But I had my two older brothers were quite a bit older than me, and one was 6 years older than me and one was 10 years older than him, so we were all pretty spread out. So by the time they got to me, they were kind of done with raising kids, I suppose, and I was sort of left to my own devices. And so I just got interested in music. I started when I was 10, and I just got interested in the music, and the instrument itself just drove me crazy. I just, you know, loved the sound of it, you know, as a little boy, you know, and at some point there was one laying around the house, and I just got messing with it, and they found a guy in a nearby town that taught me a little bit. He played in a dance band. I think he was like the utility man. He played the pedal steel, the electric guitar, and then he would double a little bit on the banjo in this dance band. And so I learned, I think he showed me about 10 tunes, you know.
Cool.
And then from there, at this point I was pretty obsessed with it, you know, where I just played all the time. I was really interested in the banjo, and I was real fortunate. My older brother we always had a lot of records around the house. We're always interested in going to see concerts and buying records and finding things. And my older brother Jimmy, he kind of instilled in me pretty early on about the concept of mastership in music, that the guys you kind of wanted to pay attention to were the masters, you know. And so he got me going on that, you know, where you try to figure out who's the masters of blues guitar, who's the master of this and that, you know, and try to tune in with the masters, you know. And at that time I didn't really have, when I started really trying to get into Earl, I didn't have any teachers or anything, so I would use tape recorders and record things and so forth to learn. And I found this fella in town that was interested in bluegrass. This would have been in like the early 70s. And I found this guy in town, and he had a son that was my age, and his son played bass and guitar and stuff, and he had like a good Gibson guitar and a good Vega banjo. His first good banjo and guitar that I'd ever seen. And he had a lot of bluegrass records, and he had an RV, would go to festivals. So I just got really interested in bluegrass through him and stuff. But at the same time, anyway, I've just been playing all the time and learning songs, trying to find records I liked and stuff like that, and been getting interested in like different production guys that I liked, and different sidemen I liked, and things I liked, songs I liked, and records and things, and got interested in that. And then when I went to school, and I went to University of Texas, and I studied audio there. And so my degree is actually in audio production. My degree is in audio. I graduated in '85 from there. But, you know, to put myself through school, I played in bands. You know, I played in country and western dance bands, and practiced the banjo a lot, and, you know, played guitar some, because I could play the banjo, I could play a little guitar, and all that stuff. I got interested in punk rock music when that happened in the late 70s. You know, I've always been sort of you know, I have like this music that I listen to for fun, which is like, I like metal and punk rock just as a music fan, you know, and stuff like that. And then when I got into school, I learned a lot about the history of recorded music, and in that regard, you study musique concrète and tape manipulators, like that early Steve Reich stuff and different things, and got interested in sound art per se in school. and got interested in avant-garde and things like that. And punk rock also. Through punk rock, you kind of got interested, because if you messed around in punk rock very long, you found out about Iggy Pop. And if you found out about Iggy Pop, you found out about John Cale. If you found out about John Cale, you found out about the Velvet Underground. And vis-a-vis John Cale, you learned about Lamont Young, who was a contemporary composer in the Fluxus movement, as sort of a just intonation guy. And,
Wow.
and so forth. And so through then Lamont Young, you found out about Terry Riley and Steve Reich and John Cage and so forth.
All these connections.
Yeah. And I don't know, it's just like I've always been obsessed with that stuff. And so my brother always showed me how to track things down. You know, he got interested in, you know, he heard the Rolling Stones, and from the Rolling Stones he figured out Chuck Berry, and from Chuck Berry he figured out Muddy Waters, and from Muddy Waters he figured out Robert Johnson, and from Robert Johnson he figured out Skip James, you know, kind of work through things like that and see where it leads you. So I guess I always kind of worked that way. I don't know if people still do that kind of stuff as much anymore, but
I can relate to that.
yeah.
Yeah, like whenever I'm learning a song, for example, this is just a kind of related to that, but I always look for like the oldest version to get some perspective.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
on like what it sounded like.
And then maybe you like the fiddler on there, and then you get his record, and
Yeah.
you know, and it's kind of a never-ending quest. Or
Exactly.
something.
It's really fun. I mean, there's so much music out there.
Yeah, there's more than you can even process. And
Totally.
it's just so neat that it's available now, because it used to not be so available. It's really hard. It used to be really hard to get records. You know, it's hard. You know, and you have to order them through the mail, and
Yeah.
it was in Texas, and sometimes they'd be warped. You know, you get them, they'd be warped, and you have to figure out like, wow, this is the Charlie Patton I was looking for, but the first two songs are warped. Do I send it back, or do I keep it? You know, and you have to kind of figure that out. How are you going to do it? You
Wow.
know? Some of them I kept, and some of them you send back, or maybe they send the wrong one, and you have this weird record, and you couldn't figure out what. Anyway, it took a lot of effort, you know, to do
Yeah,
that.
right. So this is a member question. This is a question from Robert Lane. He says, "It sounds like your fifth string is used more as a rhythmic device rather than a drone."
Okay, if you dig into I got obsessed with those guys that played Earl that weren't Earl. You ever got into those guys? They're like an Earl reduction sauce. And I always felt like Rudy Lyle and those guys, Porter Church and Don Stover and those guys.
Totally.
A lot of times they played the banjo like it was a trap kit. You know, like if you Lamar Greer and some of those guys. To me, they sounded like recently. My friend David Grisman gave me those. We were listening to those Monroe outtakes. Have you heard those?
I haven't heard those.
There's a company that's put out a bunch of those outtakes, you know,
Cool.
and you can go through, and I think a lot of it is Rudy Lyle, but you can go through and hear like 5 takes of White House Blues or whatever, and they're kind of learning it as they go. And there's like the classic version that we know, but there was like 4 or 5 versions leading up to that. You know, maybe they had to stop and tune, or maybe somebody missed a cue, but you can hear Rudy Lyle kind of learning the tunes as he goes and so forth. And I think that comes from, I really got interested in those guys that played like Earl but weren't Earl. You know, because I mean, you know, the main guys was Earl and Don Reno and Ralph, you know, and then of course Bill Keith and Bobby Thompson and so forth. But those guys that, you know, that played like Earl but weren't Earl was like, there's a lot of, and to me the way they approached it more, they might not have had a developed melodic sense as Earl, but they sort of worked on the rhythmic side. And so anyway, I feel like a lot of times the banjo has to be like a trap kit, you know. So anyway, so there's a lot of rhythmic things going on with the way I think I have this theory. My theory is high notes are low notes are high notes, and everybody's got to play the drums. That's my theory. So anyway, I think
Make a T-shirt.
Yeah, I think that like I'll be the only one that wear it. But I think that like, you know, to me the banjos, you know, is a drum, you know.
Totally.
So anyway,
It literally is a drum.
yeah. So I feel like, you know, that that's actually a pretty good observation of that. But I think I feel like it's our job to want that fifth string a lot, because like, you know, if I avoid that fifth string, you end up sounding kind of guitar-esque, you know. And I think that's like, in a sense you could look at it like your job is to play that string in a way.
Interesting.
So I try to work that. I try to use that string, and it's like, I think a lot of times, like guys would like say when you go to an E7 E dominant chord, guys will leave that string alone, but I leave it in there, And unless I'm working on a record and something the producer says that's rubbing with the chord, that's rubbing with the piano or something, he tells me specifically, don't hit that note when you're playing a B flat or something, or whatever. But I like the way that fifth string sounds over every chord. Like if you sit and play every chord, I think that fifth string sounds good. Of course, I listen to contemporary composers or whatever you call that, so it doesn't. I think every note sounds good against every other note, and every note sounds good against every chord. So that's what I think. But so I use the fifth string even in like a D flat or whatever. I stay on it. I don't know. I like the way that sounds, and it keeps making these surprises. Like if you play an F chord and you hit that fifth string, you got this kind of add 9 thing going on. Totally. If you're playing an A7 and it turns into a flat 7, you get your dominant note there, and if you're in D, you get this weird sort of suspended fourth on the D if you're holding down that F sharp on the first string and so forth. And there's a lot of beautiful stuff that happens on that string. I think that there's like some really cool happy accidents that happen with that string.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's worth it to explore it for sure.
I think there's a lot going on there with the banjo.
Yeah, because I think people instinctively think, oh, I'm in the key of D, I need to spike my fifth string to an A note.
Yeah.
But I've explored it with it open, and it's really cool.
It's really neat. Yeah. Of course, if you're trying to play like a fiddle tune or something, then you or whatever. But a lot of times, what I found out pretty early on was I would get sessions. Of course, I was living in Texas and not North Carolina or something, but I would get sessions for tunes that would be not Cripple Creek or something.
Right.
So I'd have to go in there, and the tune might be in E flat, and it might be at like 80 beats a minute, and it might have like a lot of chords in it or something. And so like the vocabulary that you learn to play Dixie Hoedown or something ain't going to help you a lot in that world, and you may have to play like a different feel on the timing and all that stuff. And so I think that's pretty good for my playing, really, to have to play on records of different types of music. Like songwriter stuff, or pop bands or rock bands or orchestra stuff, or like avant-garde things that people just write, weird things people write or whatever. I think it was good for my playing to try to do that. Because I think a lot of times, I think it's important with the banjo, if you don't mind me digressing for a second, but I think the question that we need to ask is why. Because if a person learns to play, this is just my opinion, which is, it's not worth a lot, but if a person learns to play an Earl lick or something, I think it's a really good question to ask why. What is it? What's its function? It has a function, just like those chords has a function. The B minor chord in the key of G has a function, and it does something. And I think with the Scruggs vocabulary or the Don Reno vocabulary or what have you, that a lot of that stuff has a function. And if you just learn it and you just think about tunes in terms of chords, and those are like your reference points or the changes, I think you're missing a lot of the function of the tune, how the tune moves. And also, I think it's really important to address the poetry of the lyric, because a lot of these songs have become vehicles for soloing.
Totally.
Like you take a tune like 9 Pound Hammer, it's like people will approach it like there's a lot of soloing, and maybe the soloing doesn't reflect the melodic content of the piece.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at the poetry of the song, it's important to look at the poetry of that piece, and why is that song, why is it, and how? The poetry, I think, should influence the melodic approach or the soloing or whatever. Is what is that poem saying in that song? It's worth it to ask yourself that.
Totally.
Because I had a producer one time tell me, I was working with a singer, and he said, always, if you pay attention to the lyric all the way through, it'll help you with your playing, because you're never covering up the singer. So you always know where. So I took that one step further and started trying to pay attention to what the poem was trying to say, because it influences how you look at the whole thing, But anyway.
That's so cool. So, like, just to go with that a little bit more, like using 9 Pound Hammer as an example, could you? Maybe it's time to get the banjo out. I would love to maybe hear kind of what you mean by that.
But I think like if you just take the lyric, well, a 9 Pound Hammer, it's a little too heavy for my size, rolling buddy, and things like that. It's like, well, the guy is working really hard, and he's a little bit overwhelmed, and he's trying to figure out another way of handling the situation, So there's like a tension in there in the poem, and maybe someone else would. That's the beautiful thing about poetry, is that it might have a different effect on somebody, but it's worth asking yourself that question, why, you know, and how and stuff like that. To me, with those songs, it helps to kind of figure out, like, you know, the character of the tune, you know, and stuff like that. Because, like, if a tune gets played a whole bunch of times and it gets used as a vehicle for soloing, I think the meaning of the tune can get sort of lost or something. But anyway, so I just came in my own playing. I've come to realize that about myself, you know. That's why I say it for my own use or whatever. But John always talked about his music as being like little movies and stuff, you know.
Hartford?
John Hartford, yeah, he's a friend of mine.
Oh,
He always talked about things. I think he even called them at one point. He called his songs word movies or something like that. But he, you know, and it kind of, and you used to when you made records and when you made LP records too. Like the record was really like a movie. And you had a start, and each song was like a scene in a movie. And you had like this sort of over arc. You had this like a story arc and stuff, and you had like these various scenes, you know. But I think music. Because the banjo can be sort of looked at in a real mechanical way.
Oh, for sure.
With the tablature system and these various ways, you know, you can sort of look at it as being like almost like a paint by numbers thing or something like that. But it's really an art form, and there's like, you know, it has a context of being inside of art. So anyway.
What advice would you give people learning the banjo?
Well, I think a really good thing, I mean, it's kind of got an aspect of you can because of the pedagogy or whatever of the banjo that exists, you can sort of get pretty far along mechanically. Like I remember when I used to teach, there would be, you know, a guy been playing the banjo for 2 years and they're working on, you know, Daryl Dixie or something, which actually you know, as far as like a piece of music is pretty advanced, you know. Like the violin pedagogy is really graduated, you know, like it's based, they've had hundreds of years, and the nylon-string guitar, the classical guitar system is very graduated. You know, the node book and so forth is very graduated. You learn just a little bit, and it all fits in this way.
Yeah.
The banjo pedagogy is a little bit more dump you in the hot water thing. Like they kind of show you rolls, and they show you chords, and they start building all these tunes. They don't necessarily show you where those tunes kind of come from or whatever in terms of how the melody is being played or whatnot. But to me, it's like I think I would develop an appreciation for art itself. You know, like aesthetics. I think it's important to kind of figure out your own aesthetics, you know, because that's something that gets forgotten. You know, so a lot of guys, there's a lot of records of people playing bluegrass music where it's technically correct and it's well recorded and well rendered and everything, but it doesn't really say anything. So I think like understanding and asking about what is aesthetics, what makes something valuable, what makes something good. What can be done with this? What's a high note? What's the low note? What's the effective range? What's the timbre? What's the use of it? What's the function of it? You know, these kind of aesthetic questions, you know. I just came to that point where I started dealing with it myself. I think a lot of times like composition and philosophy are on similar timelines, you know. And so the logic of the banjo is related to an aesthetic of the banjo, and what is that? You know, those things are hard to quantify or quantize or whatever, because if you say this record sold 10,000 copies, and here's the sheet music to the title track or something, those are really easily quantifiable things. Or this song starts in this key and it goes to here, that's really quantifiable. But to ask yourself, is this saying anything that I want to hear? Is this important? Is this expressing not necessarily an emotion, but is there an idea here? What's the arc, the story arc of this thing? What are the components? What's the architecture of this and things? I feel like those things aren't really being addressed sometimes, and especially with the banjo, because like I mentioned earlier, you can get pretty far along with the tablature thing and online lessons and books. I mean, there's more books. We could fill up this room with banjo books, you know. When I started, there was only 3. There was the Earl book, there was a Pete Seeger book, and there was like this really cryptic Sonny Osborne book.
I'll have to look for that one.
Yeah, it was really neat. He had his own little, Sam Bush told me he taught out of that book. When
cool.
He taught at a little store and taught out of that Sonny Osborne book. And it's great because it's Sonny, but anyway, there just wasn't that many sources like there are now. But I just think that like, it's just like when I hear people write songs, sometimes you can hear someone that writes songs and you can tell this person has never read poetry, has no interest in poetry. But I think if you're going to write songs, I think you should really get interested in poetry. If you're really going to write lyrics, you need to figure out poetry, read poetry, maybe take some online classes in it, figure out people that you like, read it a whole lot, and figure out why this stuff works. Because in poetry, the syllables are kind of like notes, where they have a value outside of the mechanical value of what it is. You see, like in a C chord, there's like a, the G, the C, and the E, but they also are sort of doing something sort of like in a sonic palette or something, like they're like colors or something, or like
sure.
sounds. Sounds are kind of quantifiable or whatever. But anyway, I think that for me, it's like if you're learning to play, you have this sort of mechanical process that you're going through, like you're reading the tablature, you learn how to play chords, and you're learning how to improvise and so forth. But I think a really good thing to start asking yourself is aesthetics. Who are the banjo players I like? Why do I like them? What problems do they solve that I think they solved in an interesting way? Like, how do you play a solo up the neck? Well, this guy has a really good way of doing that. And why is it working for him? And what? Anyway, there's a lot of books about aesthetics, like in the philosophy section, and just attitudes about aesthetics would be worth looking at, I think.
Wow, interesting.
And recording aesthetics as well, because like if you listen to a bluegrass song, there's a audio aesthetic that you're looking at. There's a poetic aesthetic, the poetics of the thing, and then there's like the musical, which would include the orchestral aesthetic of how the instruments are where in the frequency spectrum they are, and how they relate to each other, and what are they covering. Because sometimes the banjo can be really high, and the guitar can be really low, and sometimes they cross, and the banjo's playing low and the guitar's playing high. How are those orchestral sort of conundrums sort of solved with the decisions that the group has made? And some of those bands, like the Kentucky Colonels and stuff, have really interesting ways of solving that.
Interesting.
But for me, I think I would try to figure out what aesthetics are all about.
Very cool. Well, you have a new record out, right?
Yeah, Stove Up. It's a homage to Don Stover.
Oh, awesome! I didn't realize that. I should have known from the title.
Yeah. There's only like 4 Don Stover pieces on there, but it was really kind of like my sort of homage to Don Stover, who I felt like, Bill Keith told me he got the idea for his style from Don Stover. Did you know that?
No.
Okay. There's a lick that Bill heard on the radio when Don was playing with the Lilly Brothers, that you hold down an A note on the 4th string at the 7th fret, and a C natural at the 5th string on the 3rd string at the 5th fret, and it makes like a D, sort of a D7 chord, but I suppose it also has a B note in there. But anyway, he figured out he was playing that song John Hardy. It had that long D chord, that 5 chord, and he had a little lick on there, and Bill Keith heard that, and he realized from that lick he could play a scale. Classical guitar calls it arpa. It's a common technique in classical guitar where you play the next note in the scale on a lower string, and you can create sustain that way. It'll be marked arpa in the music.
Oh, cool.
But in banjo, it was like a sort of a seismic event when he figured out how he could play scales that way. You probably teach your students that, right?
For sure.
They call it melodic, which is sort of a weird word. When I was a kid, they call it chromatic banjo, which is really a weird word too, because it's not really chromatic.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you call it? Like Keith style?
I call it melodic style because that's kind of like what
people say.
People say.
But it's sort of a weird word.
But when I speak to another musician about it, I say melodic style. They're like, well,
the other is not melodic.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like calling something a color painting or something. It's like it's a category word and not a component of a category word. So anyway, he came up with that lick from Don Stover, which I think is like kind of cool. And Don wrote songs as well.
Yeah.
And he was a singer in front of the band, and that record, Things in Life, was just one of my all-time favorite records. That and that Aeroplane record were just huge records for me.
I'll have to check Aeroplane out. I haven't heard that.
Not the outtakes, but the original Aeroplane record that David Bromberg produced was one of my favorite all-time records.
It's a Don Stover record?
No, it's John Hartford.
Oh, a Hartford record.
Yeah. Steam-Powered Airplane was on there.
Yeah.
That record, and the Don Stover record, Things in Life. Those are my two, like, sort of.
I see what you're saying. Cool.
Where the banjo gets used I think the aesthetics of that Steam-Powered Airplane were really interesting, and I don't think that record has ever been surpassed in terms of using bluegrass as like a medium for art. I don't think that record has ever been beat, in terms of poetics and just using the instruments as a way of making this really futuristic music. You know, like I don't think you can, if you go back in time and when that record was new, what was interesting about that record is it was old and new at the same time. When you listen to it now, it's out of context. It doesn't seem that groundbreaking in a way.
Right.
But at the time, it was like that scene in Wizard of Oz where everything goes into color. You know, it was really a mind-blowing record.
And I need to re-listen to it with that like kind of.
It'd be worth like listening to that record only for like 6 months. It'd be worth it, you know, just to only listen to that record for like 6 months because the way the instruments work together, the orchestration, the poetry, you know, what's happening, the what that evokes in you, the pathos and the joviality and the playfulness and the sadness and the sort of mystique and all these things that are in there, you know, are like they're like big boulders, you know. You kind of got to deal with them, you know what I mean? And you know what I'm saying? And I think if we make when we make records without those elements, you know, they're just not as listenable, you know. Like so many times with a CD, you put it on and they're so long, you know, and it's easy to get lost and you turn it down and start talking or something.
Right.
But I think this, from an aesthetic perspective, that record has not been beaten.
Wow. Well, Danny, I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
That's okay.
This is awesome, man. Thanks so much for talking to me about this.
You're welcome. Thanks, Bennett.
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.